The gate did not close behind her with a sound of finality. That was the thing Seren would remember longest, not the slam of iron, not the dramatic thunder of a portcullis, not any of the sounds that should have accompanied the ending of a life. The gate swung shut with the ordinary mechanical indifference of a door that had opened and closed 10,000 times before her and would open and close 10,000 times after. Its iron hinges completing their arc with the bored efficiency of something that had never once cared what it was separating. Behind that gate, the city continued. The market vendors called their morning prices. The cartwheels rolled over the same cobblestones they had rolled over yesterday. The children who had been running between the stalls when she walked out were still running, and their laughter carried the clean, careless quality of people who had not noticed that anything had changed, because for them nothing had. She had left the way a low draft left a room when a door was opened briefly, barely perceptibly, already forgotten. She turned south because south was the only direction no one else was walking. The road ended at the boundary stone, the last carved marker of the kingdom's formal territory, beyond which the map showed only blank gray and the notation, uninhabited. She walked past it without stopping. There was nothing to stop for. The wasteland received her the way it received everything, with absolute silence, absolute gray, absolute indifference to whether she lived or vanished into it entirely. The sky above it was the same color as the ground below it, and the air between them moved without warmth or intention, and there was no sound at all. At the boundary stone's shadow, without deciding to, without planning the gesture or understanding why her body made it, she knelt. She pressed both palms flat to the dead soil. The earth was cold and hard and empty beneath her hands. The gray light moved over the wasteland's surface and touched nothing. Nothing answered. Not yet. Which country are you listening from right now? Please drop it in the comments below. I would love to know how far this story reaches, because this story deserves to travel, and so do you. The wasteland did not care that she was tired. She had known it would not. She had not expected the landscape to accommodate her. She had not expected anything from the south except the specific mercy of being somewhere that did not know her name or have an opinion about what she was worth. This was, she had decided in the 4 days of walking since the gate, a modest but genuine form of freedom. She walked south along the faint track worn into the dead ground by the steady southward movement of other exiled and forgotten persons, a path that should not have existed in a place everyone said was empty, but which existed because there had always been more people sent this way than the northern records chose to count. She slept in the shallow lee of rock formations. She ate the dried provisions she had packed carefully in the 2 days between the guard's visit and the exile's formal commencement. She had spent those 2 days finishing the harvest. This was the thing her mind returned to, again and again, in the gray silence of the wasteland's first week. Not the exile order itself, not the guard's businesslike expression, not the specific cold language the council had used to drain on pack resources. No demonstrable alpha-compatible traits, no bloodline contribution. What she returned to was the harvest. She had spent 2 of her 3 allotted days finishing the autumn harvest, so it would not rot in the field after she was gone. She had cleaned and labeled every preserved jar, organized the root cellar in the specific order the community understood, turned the winter beds and laid the mulch, and done every preparatory task that the garden needed to sustain the people who depended on it through the cold months ahead. She had done all of this for people who had signed a document without asking her name. She had not been able to do otherwise, and this was the thing she was working through as she walked, not with resentment, exactly, but with the careful attention she brought to problems she wanted to understand fully. The need had been real regardless of what had been done to her. The garden had genuinely needed tending. The jars had genuinely needed labeling. The people who would eat from the root cellar through the winter were not the council members who had passed the exile motion. They were the elderly woman with the bad hip who had eaten Seren's preserved plums every winter for 12 years and called them the best thing about the cold months. And the family in the eastern row with 3 young children who supplemented their diet with the garden's surplus from early spring through late autumn. The need had been real, and she had answered it. And she was trying to decide whether this made her admirable or simply too deeply conditioned to stop. She was inclined, after 4 days of walking, toward a complicated third option. That the giving had been genuinely hers, freely chosen. And that the mistake was not in the giving but in the never being asked what she needed in return. The memories came the way the wasteland cold came, not in a single impact, but gradually, seeping through the edges of her awareness as she walked, finding the places she had not successfully sealed off. She had been 7 years old when she first understood, with the particular clarity of children who have not yet learned to resist clear understanding, that she was not what the pack had been built to value. This understanding had not arrived through cruelty. That was the part that had always been most difficult to explain, to herself and to the rare person she had ever tried to explain it to. There had been no particular cruelty directed at her. No one had targeted her, beaten her, singled her out for deliberate degradation. She had simply been consistently, thoroughly, systematically not counted. Her name did not appear on the pack's resource assessments under any category that registered as valuable. The contributions she made to the communal life, 15 years of extraordinary garden yields, consistent quality care for the sick and the elderly, the quiet daily work of keeping the community's food supply functional, were not measurable by the instruments the pack had built to measure things. The instruments measured alpha compatibility, bloodline strength, defensive capacity, economic assets brought to the pack through bonding or inheritance. These were real things that real communities genuinely needed. And Seren had never argued against their importance. She had only ever noted, quietly and privately, that a community also needed to eat, and that the person who ensured that it ate with consistent reliability might warrant some small portion of the attention directed toward bloodline assessment. She had noted this quietly and privately because she had understood by age 12 that noting it aloud would accomplish nothing except marking her as difficult in addition to insufficient. The council had reviewed her case in a standard administrative session. She had learned the details afterward from a sympathetic young records administrator who had felt guilty enough about the whole proceeding to tell her the shape of it. The review had taken 11 minutes. The exile motion had been proposed by the pack's senior bloodline assessor, seconded by the council's defense representative, and passed by a vote of 7-1, without what the official record called significant debate. The single dissenting voice had belonged to a junior council member named, the administrator had told her, Wesson, who had asked whether the subject had been consulted before the assessment's conclusion. The senior assessor had responded that the criteria were objective and that consultation with subjects was not part of the established procedure. 11 minutes. 23 years of her life. Assessed and concluded and filed in 11 minutes in a room she had not been invited to enter. She had been in the garden. She had been turning the late-season compost when it happened, which struck her now, walking in the wasteland. As having a specific quality of bitter poetry, she had been feeding the ground that fed the pack at the precise moment the pack decided it was done with her. The guard who had come to her door that afternoon had been a young man she half recognized from the market she had treated him once, in passing, for a sprained wrist that he had been too proud to report to the official healers. He had been professional and clearly uncomfortable and not unkind, which she had found, in some distant and tired corner of her awareness, almost thoughtful of someone to arrange. He had shown her the official document and explained the terms 3 days to arrange her departure. The boundary stone at the southern roads end to be passed before the 3rd day's sunset, and he had let her read the document in full when she asked, which not every guard bothered to permit. She had read the royal signature at the document's base for a long time. King Selim. The script was confident and neat, and had the practiced fluency of a man who signed many documents each day and had not paused over this one. There was nothing in the signature to suggest hesitation, reconsideration, or any awareness that the person named in the document above it was a living human being with a history and a particular way of pressing her hands into soil and a knowledge of when the pear trees needed pruning that had taken 11 years to develop. She did not feel hatred toward that signature. She had examined this carefully over 4 days of walking and had been honest with herself about what she found. What she felt about King Selim's signature was a profound and clarifying indifference, the specific indifference of someone who has been invisible to another person for so long that the other person's actions no longer register as personal. He had signed because it was put in front of him and it required a signature. She had not been worth enough consideration to generate an active emotion about. He had been turning to the next item on the agenda before the ink was dry. This was not cruelty. She had thought about this carefully enough to be certain. Cruelty required attention. What she had received was its opposite, a complete and effortless absence of attention that had nonetheless ended her life in the place she had known, just as effectively as cruelty would have. She was still deciding which was harder to forgive. On the 4th day of walking, she reached a formation of gray rocks that created 3 sides of something approximately like shelter, a shallow alcove that blocked the wind from the northwest and the north and left her facing south toward the wasteland's blank continuation. She sat down. She ate the last of her provisions. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest and the cold pressing in from every remaining direction, and the wasteland offering nothing, absolutely nothing, in every direction as far as she could see. She thought, I have nowhere to go. Then she thought, I have nowhere I am required to go. These were different thoughts, and the difference mattered, and she sat with the difference for a while. She laid her hands flat on the dead ground beside her and closed her eyes, because her hands had always found their way to the earth when the rest of her ran out of direction. And old habits were more honest than strategic choices, and she was too tired for strategies. She did not mean to fall asleep with her hands in the soil. She had intended a brief rest, 15, perhaps 20 minutes in the shallow shelter of the rock alcove. Enough to let the bone weariness of 4 days of solitary walking settle to a manageable level. Enough to think practically about what came next. What came next was a question she had been deferring with great discipline since the gate. Because the honest and complete answer to what comes next when a person has been exiled to a dead wasteland with no food remaining, and no shelter, and no community, and no particular knowledge of wilderness survival, was not a thought she could think without it becoming the only thought, and the only thought was not useful. She had told herself, 15 minutes. Rest, then think. She opened her eyes to morning. The light was thin and gray, and coming in at a low angle that told her with certainty that she had slept through the entire night without moving. This in itself was strange. She had always been a restless sleeper in ordinary beds with blankets and comfort on all sides. And she had been sleeping on bare rock and dead earth with nothing between her skin and the cold of both. But her body had apparently decided that after 4 days of continuous walking it would sleep through anything, which she supposed was reasonable. And she filed this observation and moved on to the more immediate one. Her hands were still pressed flat to the soil exactly where she had placed them before she lost consciousness. Beneath her palms, emerging from the gray dead soil with the specific and unhurried determination of things that have been waiting a very long time for precisely the right conditions to present themselves, were plants. She was still for a long time. Not many, not a field, not a meadow, not anything that could be called dramatic or overwhelming. A modest radius, perhaps 16 to 18 inches measured from the center of each palm, of tentative and luminous green pushing upward through soil that had no business hosting it. Small leaves with the delicate translucency of newly emerged growth. Pale stems carrying that particular quality of living things that have recently come from darkness. Root structures already visible at the soil surface in the places where the upward pressure was greatest. Lifting the earth in small gentle mounds the way a sleeping person's breath lifted a blanket from below, steadily alive. She watched them for a long time without changing her position, without lifting her hands, without making any decision. She simply looked. She had always believed that looking completely, before doing or concluding or deciding, was the most important discipline available to a person. And she applied it now to the impossible small garden growing from her palms in a wasteland that should have been empty of everything. Then she ran, methodically and without self-deception, through every explanation that did not require her to accept what she was beginning to accept. Her body heat might have warmed the soil sufficiently. She dismissed this immediately, because it had been a deeply cold night and body heat was not capable of raising the temperature of dead compacted earth by any meaningful measure. And the soil beyond the 18-inch radius of her hands was exactly as gray and hard and cold as it had been the previous afternoon. Seeds carried inadvertently on her clothing or in her hair dismissed. Because seeds required weeks of germination in ideal conditions with consistent moisture and warmth. And also because the plants beneath her hands did not have the quality of germinating seeds. They had the quality of plants that had always existed in potential in this ground and had been given, overnight, the specific condition they required to become actual. She had heard, once, in a book she had borrowed from the community library and read in 3 days, because no one else had requested it, and it seemed wasteful not to, that certain ancient wolf territories in the far south had once sustained an Omega practice called verdant gift, the capacity to restore life to dead or depleted ground through sustained physical contact. The book had described it as mythological. She had read it with the dispassionate interest she brought to mythology and moved on to the next chapter. She pressed her hands back down. The warmth began immediately. Not her warmth, not the surface heat of skin against cold earth, but something deeper and more directional. Moving outward from a source below her palms in a current that she felt from the inside rather than the outside. It was the first time she had felt it consciously, with full attention, and what she recognized in it was familiar. The same warmth she had always felt when she worked in the gardens. The same quality of something moving from her into the ground, which she had attributed to 10,000 other explanations over 15 years, because no other explanation had been available. It was leaving her. That was the precise and accurate sensation, leaving. As though something she had always carried without knowing it was being carried had finally found a door and was walking through it. Into the earth, where it knew without instruction or design exactly what it was for. The cold followed the warmth. It came in degree by degree, replacing what had left, working inward from her fingertips toward her palms, toward her wrists. It was not the cold of the air or the ground, it was the cold of depletion. The specific interior cold of a body giving something away. She registered it with the practical attention she brought to all information. This is the cost. The warmth leaves, and the cold replaces it. The green grows while the cold grows. The exchange is real and specific, and the ratio appears to be consistent. She stayed with her hands in the ground for 2 hours. When she finally withdrew them, because the cold had reached past her elbows to her upper arms, because her fine motor control in her fingers had reduced to something she did not want to push past, because she understood with clear practical certainty that continuing beyond this point alone in a wasteland would cost more than she could safely spend the living radius extended 4 feet from where she knelt. Not grass, not crops, not anything immediately useful for sustenance. Organisms she could not yet name, varieties she had never seen in northern catalogs, growing in soil that had been labeled uninhabitable for 2 centuries. But alive, unmistakably, irrevocably, stubbornly alive. She sat back on her heels and looked at her hands. The blue-white cold quality of her skin was already beginning to fade as her circulation reasserted itself, the warmth reclaiming her from the fingertips outward. In 4 or 5 hours, she would be fully warm again. Tomorrow she could press her hands into the soil again. She thought about the pear tree. She had been 16. The orchard's oldest tree, a pear that had been producing fruit since before her grandmother was born, had begun to fail in early autumn, dropping its leaves 3 weeks before the others, the bark acquiring the dull gray texture of timber that had decided its work was finished. She had asked the pack's senior gardener whether anything could be done, and he had said with genuine gentleness, "Some trees simply reach the end, and the kindest thing is to let them go." She had accepted this. She had gone back to her work. She had thought about the tree for 3 days and had not been able to stop thinking about it, the pull of it quiet and persistent in her chest. And on the 3rd night she had gone to the orchard alone in the dark because she could not stay in her cottage and do nothing, and she had pressed both hands flat to the bark. The warmth had left her so completely and so quickly that she had fallen to her knees in the grass beneath the tree and stayed there for more than an hour, her back against its roots, too depleted to stand, watching the bark beneath where her hands had been. In the morning the tree was putting out new growth. In late autumn, small bright leaves along branches that had been preparing to die. The bark returned to the warm living brown of healthy wood, the whole tree carrying a quality of renewed attention of a living thing that had decided, overnight, that it had more to do. She had told no one. She had gone back to the garden and kept her hands to herself and said, when anyone remarked on the pear tree's surprising recovery, that some trees had more resilience than expected, and perhaps the autumn had been gentler than they thought. She had been 16, and she had already understood, with the particular precision of someone who had been not counted for long enough to know exactly what that meant, that claiming something extraordinary was an act that carried specific risks and should not be undertaken without a clear accounting of those risks. Now she sat in a dead wasteland 4 days from the city that had exiled her and looked at the impossible living radius her hands had made, and she thought about the pear tree. And she thought about the 16 years of extraordinary garden yields that everyone had attributed to good conditions and seasonal variation. And she thought about the warmth she had always felt moving from her into the ground when she worked with full attention. And she stopped explaining it as anything other than what it was. She looked at the wasteland extending in every direction, gray and flat and silent and absolutely, supernaturally dead. She looked back at the green. She made a decision that was less a decision than a recognition, something locating itself in her chest with the settling quality of a thing that had always been true and was only now being acknowledged. She was not going to leave this place. She was going to press her hands into this ground every morning until she understood the full shape of what she was, and until that understanding showed her what it could become, and until she had gone as far as it would take her. She had no other direction. She had no other purpose waiting. And the ground beneath her hands was alive, and it was alive because of her. And that was more than the city behind her had ever been able to say. On the 7th day, she gave the green a name. Not the settlement, there was no settlement yet. Only her and the spreading radius of impossible growth, and the rock alcove she had improved by hauling flat stones into a rough three-sided structure that now blocked the wind from three directions and held warmth with something approaching adequacy. She named the green itself. She called it the start, because it was the start, and accuracy had always mattered more to her than poetry. And she had never seen the point of dressing a plain truth in borrowed elegance when the truth itself was sufficient. She had begun to understand the gift's rhythm by the seventh day, the way she had always understood the rhythms of living things through patient, consistent observation, without preconceptions about what the pattern should be, letting the pattern show itself at its own pace. Morning sessions were the most productive. Her body had recovered overnight, the warmth rebuilt to its full available depth. And the current that flowed from her palms was consistent and strong for the first 90 minutes before the cold began its inward march. During those 90 minutes, the green expanded at its most vigorous rate, not merely in surface area, but in depth, the root networks extending downward and outward, the mycorrhizal web between the growing plants thickening, the soil itself being transformed at a structural level by whatever the gift was transmitting. Evening sessions were shorter and produced a different quality of growth, slower, deeper, more root-focused, as though the gift understood that the day's available light was ending and chose to spend its remaining resources on infrastructure rather than surface expression. She found this interesting, that the gift had a kind of practical intelligence, an awareness of context and appropriate allocation. It was not a simple mechanism. It was something more like a relationship. She kept notes in the margins of the single book. She had brought south the Northern Plant Variety Guide she had been consulting when the guard arrived, and had carried out of habit, her hands needing something to hold in those first stunned minutes. The margins were filling quickly with observations the guide's author had never had reason to anticipate, written in the small, precise handwriting she used for all records that mattered. Between sessions, when her body was recovering its warmth and the wasteland extended in every direction doing what wastelands did, absolutely nothing, with absolute consistency the memories surfaced. She had stopped trying to redirect them, because redirection cost energy she needed for other things. She let them come, and she examined them with the same empirical patience she brought to the gift's mechanics, trying to understand the full shape of what had happened to her over 23 years. Not for the purpose of grieving it, she had a limited appetite for grief as a sustained state, but for the purpose of understanding it accurately, because understanding it accurately was the only way to ensure that what she was building now did not replicate its failures. The communal gardens had been her responsibility since she was 8 years old. The assignment had come through the pack's labor distribution system, which was administered by a kind and well-meaning functionary who had looked at 8-year-old Seren and looked at the garden duty roster and matched available capacity to available need without any particular malice or insight. The garden work was low status, time-consuming, and physically demanding in ways that did not map onto the pack's conventional metrics of impressive contribution. It required no aggression, no dominance, no visible strength. It required patience and attention, and the specific knowledge that accumulated only through sustained practice over years. It was in the pack's implicit hierarchy of valuable work, approximately at the level of necessary background noise. Seren had understood all of this and had decided, early and clearly, that she did not agree with the assessment. She had learned the gardens the way she had learned everything that mattered to her, by giving them her complete and sustained attention for a long time, without agenda, letting the understanding build itself from what she actually observed rather than from what she expected to find. She had learned which beds needed which amendments and when, the rotation cycles that kept the soil from depleting, The companion planting relationships that reduced pest pressure and improved yields. Welcome back to the Whispers of Alpha King channel. Today we're going to present a new story that I believe you'll be very curious about and interested in because of its incredibly captivating content. Now let's explore it together until the end of the video. This is a fictional story compiled from various sources, supported by AI, and the content is purely for entertainment and educational purposes. The specific water requirements of each variety in each season, the signs of distress and the signs of health, and the subtle graduated states between them. She had learned what healthy soil felt like under her hands, the specific quality of well-inoculated living earth versus depleted earth, the warmth of active biological activity versus the cold of dead mineral substrate. And she had learned, gradually, and without being able at the time to name what she was learning, that the gardens did not respond to her the way they responded to anyone else who worked them. When she spent 3 hours with her hands in a bed, the yields from that bed in the following weeks exceeded the yields from identical beds that had received only conventional care. When she laid her palms flat on a depleted section and let the warmth flow, which she had always done instinctively when a section felt wrong, the same way she might have pressed her hand to a feverish child's forehead, the section recovered faster than soil science predicted it should. When she knelt at the perimeter of a new planting and worked her way along its length with both hands pressed to the earth, the germination rate was consistently higher than the seed stock's documented performance. For 15 years these results had been recorded in the harvest logs as favorable soil conditions and seasonal variation. She had read those entries every year and had said nothing, because the alternative claiming that she was the cause, that something in her hands was doing something that could not be explained by conventional agronomy, was the alternative of a person willing to stand in front of the pack and say, "I am more than you have decided I am." She had understood at every age that this claim, made by a person with no status, no alpha markers, no bloodline value, and no other conventional credentials, would not be received as truth. It would be received as delusion, as overreach, as the particular uncomfortable ambition of someone who should know their place. She had been right about this. She was more certain of it now in exile than she had been when she made the original calculation. The pack would not have received it well. The suppression would have been immediate and complete. She had simply not expected that the alternative, staying quiet, staying useful, staying invisible, would produce an exile order that did not know what it was exiling. She had stayed invisible so successfully that the decision to remove her had been made with the same attention given to clearing a piece of furniture that no longer served its original purpose. The dying pear tree came back to her on the 7th evening. She was sitting at the edge of the green radius in the cooling evening air, watching the day's growth settle, when the memory arrived with the particular vividness that memories had when they carried something still unfinished. She had been 16, and the tree had been failing, and she had spent 3 days after the senior gardener told her to let it go, being unable to let it go, the pull of it in her chest quiet and constant, and entirely uninterested in her decision to be practical. On the 3rd night she had walked to the orchard in the dark because she needed to stop thinking about the tree, and the only way to stop thinking about the tree was to go to it. She had pressed her hands to the bark. The warmth had left her so fast and so completely that she had dropped straight to her knees and stayed there for an hour with her back against the roots, depleted to a depth she had never reached before, watching the bark where her hands had been with the sustained attention of someone who did not know what they expected to see, but could not look away. In the morning the tree was putting out new leaves in late autumn, fresh growth on branches that should have been bare for the winter. The bark returned to healthy living brown, the whole tree carrying the quality of something that had been through something serious and decided to continue anyway. She had told no one. She had gone back to her daily work and attributed the recovery to natural resilience and never mentioned it to the senior gardener or anyone else. And she had been 16 and afraid of what claiming it would cost her. Now she was 23 and sitting in a dead wasteland, and the same warmth had made 50 square feet of dead ground alive overnight. And the question of what it would cost her to claim it seemed, in her current context, considerably less frightening than it had at 16. The sound of footsteps broke through the evening's silence. On the wasteland track, the faint worn path of southward movement, a figure was walking with the particular gait of someone operating on determination rather than energy, each step deliberate, each placement of the foot a small act of will against the evidence of exhaustion. Female, perhaps 50 years old, broad through the shoulders, carrying a pack that had been reduced to minimum necessity. She moved with the specific self-sufficiency of a woman who had been managing alone for long enough, that it had stopped feeling like hardship and had become simply how things were. She stopped at 30 meters. She had seen the green from a distance and stopped mid-step, and she stood on the path with the still, focused expression of a person whose model of the world had just encountered information that did not fit any of its existing categories, and who was choosing to engage with that information seriously rather than dismiss it. She looked at the green. She looked at Seren. She looked at the green again, then back at Seren, then at the ground between them. She was running the same assessment Seren had run on the first morning, looking for explanations that did not require her to accept what she was seeing, and reaching the same conclusion. She stepped off the path. She walked to the edge of the living radius and stopped there. She looked down at it for a long moment, then knelt and pressed her own hand flat to the soil at the living radius's edge, feeling the difference between the dead ground beyond and the living ground within. Her face did something complicated and private and specific, the expression of a person who has survived a long time on a diet of very little and has just been offered something warm, and is not yet certain they have permission to take it. She said, in a voice that had not been used for speaking in some days, "Is that real?" Seren looked at the green, at the small impossible living radius extending from where she sat in the middle of a wasteland that should not have permitted it to exist. She said, "Yes." The woman remained kneeling at the edge of the living soil for a moment longer, her hand pressed to the boundary where dead ground became alive. Then she sat down fully, both hands in the living earth now. And the particular quality of her exhale was the sound of someone who has been holding something tight for a very long time and has finally found somewhere to set it down. She said, "My name is Dova." Seren said, "I am Seren." Dova looked at the living radius, and at the wasteland beyond it, and back at the living radius, with the expression of a woman conducting a rapid and serious reassessment of several things simultaneously. She said, "How far does it go?" Seren looked at the green, small and tentative and absolutely real, already larger today than it had been yesterday, already pushing outward toward tomorrow's possibility, with the steady, unhurried confidence of something that knows it has found its conditions and intends to use them. She said, "I do not know yet." She paused. "I am going to find out." 3 years was not a long time to build a kingdom. It was, however, enough time to build Greenhold if the person building it pressed her hands into the ground every morning without exception, and if the people who arrived to help her brought with them the particular quality of commitment that belonged to people who had survived the experience of having nowhere else to go, and if the community that emerged from those conditions decided, at a foundational level, that what they were building was not a camp or a refuge or a temporary arrangement, but a permanent answer to a question the North had asked without meaning to. The question was, what happens to the people you throw away? The answer was this: The second person after Dova arrived 6 days after Dova. Another exiled Omega, middle-aged, who had been walking south for 2 weeks with the grim determination of someone who has run out of alternatives and has decided that at least moving forward is more dignified than stopping. She arrived at the end of a long day with seeds in her pockets, 3 varieties of drought-tolerant grain that she had kept through the entire walk south because they had seemed worth keeping. Though she had not known at the time why, and Seren had taken these seeds with the feeling of receiving something more important than their material value warranted. The third arrived 2 days after that. The fourth brought her daughter. The fifth brought 3 others who had been camped 2 miles north, waiting to see whether the rumor of green in the dead south was true before committing their direction to it. By the end of the first month, 23 people lived at the green's edge. By the end of the third month, 80. By the end of the first year, 217. And the calculation of who constituted the community had expanded in ways Seren had not initially anticipated. Not all of them were exiled Omegas. Some were families who had followed exiled wives and mothers south, rather than remain in a pack that had made its values visible. Some were wolves who had never been formally exiled, but who had been forgotten in the more gradual ways the elderly, who had been moved to the pack's margins. The unconventional, who had made their communities uncomfortable. The ones whose gifts and capacities did not map onto any recognized category of pack value. They came because word traveled on the roads between the northern settlements, and what word said was this: there is a place in the south where the ground is alive and everyone is counted. The settlement's name was given by the first arrivals and not by Seren. She had been thinking of something practical and functional south camp, perhaps, or the settlement, or simply here. The community overruled her with the gentle collective authority of people who understood that they were naming something permanent and intended to honor that with the attention it deserved. Greenhold, they called it. Seren had said, when the name was proposed. That is a bold thing to name a place that is 3 months old. Dova had said, that is why we are naming it that. Bold names create bold intentions. Greenhold's governance developed the way the green developed, not from a blueprint handed down from above, but through the practical requirements of specific people in specific circumstances, growing toward the shape of what was genuinely needed. Seren had proposed the council at the end of the first month, when it had become clear that 23 people were making too many decisions through informal conversation with her at its center, and that this model would not survive scaling. The council's foundational rules had been simple: every voice heard before any decision made. Every decision requiring something approaching consensus rather than majority rule. Every meeting open to any community member who wished to observe. It was slow. It was sometimes repetitive. It was occasionally maddening in the specific way of processes that refused to sacrifice thoroughness for efficiency. It was the most genuinely functional governance Seren had ever witnessed, which she noted with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose previous experience of governance had been a council that spent 11 minutes on a person's life. Dova became the council's most essential and most difficult member, fierce in defense of the principles she had developed through 15 years of exile and exile-adjacent experience. Absolutely unwilling to accept any procedure that allowed efficiency to override justice, and possessed of a memory for precedent that meant no one could claim a decision was consistent with past practice without Dova being able to demonstrate, with specific dated examples, whether that claim was accurate. Seren's daily work remained the soil. Every morning, before the community woke and before the day's administrative demands began, she walked to the expansion perimeter and pressed her hands into the earth for 90 minutes. The green moved outward each day a few feet in every direction, steady and consistent. The radius expanding in the quiet way of things that work by accumulation rather than event. She had learned to ration the sessions precisely. The gift was reliable when managed within its sustainable range and unpredictable when pushed past it. And the community's survival depended on her consistent daily capacity rather than on the heroic maximum output of single overwhelming sessions. First year, 1 acre of living ground. Second year, 10. With the first grain crops producing a yield that exceeded their own domestic consumption and generated a small surplus. Third year, 50 acres and a surplus substantial enough to export, which was when the North began paying attention. The emissary appeared at Greenhold's north gate in the middle of the third autumn's harvest. He wore the Northern Kingdom's colors and had the diplomatic posture of a man who had been instructed to make a request sound like an offer. He was thin and travel-worn and had the specific expression of someone who had expected to be dealing with a struggling marginal settlement and was recalibrating rapidly upon encounter with what Greenhold actually was. He said, "The North has experienced consecutive harvest failures. The Council is aware that the southern settlement has produced significant agricultural surplus. The Council is prepared to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement." Dova, who had come to stand at Seren's left at the gate with the expression of a woman who had been waiting 15 years to be on the correct side of a conversation like this one, said, "The North is aware of our surplus now that it needs something from us. That is a different thing from the North having been aware of us when we needed something from it." The emissary had no adequate response to this, because it was accurate. Seren looked at this man who was not responsible for what had been done to her or to the hundreds of people building their lives behind her, and who was asking for help on behalf of hungry people who were also not responsible for what had been done. And she felt the familiar pull, quiet and directional, pointing her toward the need rather than toward the people who had created the conditions for it. She said precisely, "Tell the Council that Greenhold's sovereign governing body will consider any formal request submitted through proper diplomatic channels." She said, "Diplomatic channels means a formal document with specific terms, submitted to our Council for review, not a conversation at a gate." 2 more emissaries arrived over the following weeks. Neither brought what was needed. The third came close, but his instructions had not included the degree of honesty that Seren required before a conversation could become productive. None of them came back with results. The North was not starving dramatically. That was the specific cruelty of a slow famine. It arrived in increments small enough that each one could be managed as an anomaly, contextualized as temporary, addressed with adjustments that bought time without solving the underlying problem. Granary reports described shortfalls in the careful language of officials who understood that the word they were not using was famine. Physicians submitted notes about child malnutrition framed as seasonal illness with nutritional components. Merchant assessments used the word challenging, where an honest document would have used failing. The kingdom's administrative language had developed, over the years of Selim's reign, a sophisticated vocabulary for describing difficulty without requiring anyone to say directly what the difficulty was. King Selim read all of these at his council table and felt something he had not felt in 20 years of governance. The particular helplessness of a man who has built every available skill and deployed every available resource and found that none of them addressed the actual problem. He had built the northern defenses to their current extraordinary strength. He had maintained diplomatic relationships with every relevant neighboring power. He had managed the kingdom's finances with careful and consistent discipline and had passed the treasury to the current moment in better condition than he had received it. None of these accomplishments grew grain. The 3 emissaries he sent south had returned with increasingly unhelpful reports. The first had described a settlement of modest size with unexpectedly high agricultural output and a leadership structure he could not categorize. The second had described the same settlement as significantly larger than his predecessor's report had suggested, and had used the word sovereign in a way that his predecessor had not, which Selim had noted and set aside for later consideration. The third had come back pale and shaken, and had said, without being asked and with the quality of urgency that indicated he had been waiting to say it since he crossed the northern border on the return journey, Your Majesty, the settlement in the south is not what we were sent to find. He had then described Greenhold in terms that bore no resemblance to the marginal cultivation project the council had briefed against. Selim rode south himself 2 days later. He traveled as Run, a northern grain merchant, with 2 guards dressed as trading associates. He had established a cover identity with the specific internal discipline of a man who understood that a king arriving openly in a settlement his kingdom had spent 3 emissaries failing to negotiate with would not produce the quality of observation he needed. He needed to see Greenhold before Greenhold knew it was being seen by him. The cover identity chafed in the specific way that performing an inferior role always chafed, not from wounded pride, exactly, but from the friction of operating without the tools and standing his position normally provided. He was accustomed to rooms that reconfigured themselves around his entrance. He was accustomed to his questions being answered before they were fully formed. He was not accustomed to being given a task by a community member who had assessed his physical capacity and decided he was good for carrying irrigation pipe. He had sorted pipe for 3 hours on his first day in Greenhold. He had found it clarifying. Physical work of the specific and practical kind created a quality of observation that strategy sessions in palace council chambers did not. He watched Greenhold while his hands were busy with something else, and what he saw, stripped of the evaluative overlay that kingship had made automatic in him, was a community that had organized itself around entirely different principles than any he had administered. The first sight of it from the ridge above the southern plain had stopped him for nearly 5 minutes. He had prepared himself, intellectually, for a settlement that was larger and more productive than the emissaries' reports had fully conveyed. He had not prepared himself for the specific quality of the view from the ridge, the particular shock of green against the gray wasteland surrounding it. The way Greenhold sat in the dead land, like a correction of everything that should have been true about that ground. The green was not merely the green of functioning agriculture. It was abundant, dense, specific, the green of a living system that had been operating at full capacity long enough to develop the depth and variety of something genuinely established. And it extended further than his eye could trace from the ridge. The living territory pushing outward in every direction against the dead ground surrounding it with the particular confidence of something that intended to keep going. He had stood on the ridge for nearly 5 minutes, and then he had ridden down. The market was mid-morning, busy in the easy, purposeful way of a community that had its rhythms fully established and its needs met. People moved between the stalls and the work areas and the common spaces with the productive ease of people who had enough to do and enough to sustain them doing it. There were children running between the adults, which struck him as more significant than it might have otherwise. Children ran freely in communities that were safe enough to permit it, and the specific quality of how children use shared space was one of the more reliable indicators of a community's fundamental health. He found Seren across the square and knew her before he knew who he was looking at. She was directing the morning's planting coordination with the economical language of someone for whom this work had become completely internalized. 3 teams. For decisions, 6 people redirected to more efficient positions. And all of it accomplished with the quiet authority of a person who had stopped needing to assert her competence and simply expressed it. She moved without theater, without the performed confidence of someone who needed to be seen being competent. She was simply doing the work, in the way she had clearly been doing it for 3 years. And the community moved around her, and with her in the specific collaborative pattern of people who had been working together long enough to have developed fluency. He introduced himself as Run when she turned his direction. She looked at him with direct, assessing eyes, not hostile, not deferential. Simply present and attentive in the specific way of a person who looked at things as they were rather than as she had decided they would be. She said, "North." Not a question. He said, "Yes." She said, "What brings you south?" He said, "I heard there was something worth seeing." She looked at him with the expression of a person filing something under provisional and said, "Most people from the north do not see it until they have already looked away once." Then she gave him the irrigation pipe and went back to the planting coordination. And he carried pipe until midday and watched everything. He sorted irrigation piping for the rest of the morning and found the physical simplicity of it unexpectedly useful. Physical work of the specific, practical, hand-occupying kind created a quality of observation he could not achieve behind a council table. His hands were busy and his mind was free, and his eyes moved through Greenhold without agenda, which was a condition of perception he had not experienced in 20 years of governance. He watched without the constant evaluation of utility that kingship had installed in him as thoroughly as his training in law or military strategy. The council meeting in the open hall that afternoon was the most unusual thing he had witnessed since taking the throne. It was literally open, both doors wide, any community member free to enter, sit, observe, or contribute through a recognized comment process. 12 council members of different ages, different origins, different statuses within the community governed by one foundational rule. Every relevant perspective heard before any decision finalized. Decisions required something that operated much closer to genuine consensus than to majority vote, which meant the process was slow and occasionally repetitive, and sometimes required a second session to resolve what a single vote could have concluded in 3 minutes. He sat in the back corner of the hall through 90 minutes of this process and did not speak. And what he observed at the end of those 90 minutes was that every decision made in this hall had been genuinely examined from multiple angles before it was reached, and that the people leaving the hall after it concluded, whether they had gotten what they wanted or not, left with the specific quality of people who had been heard rather than processed. He ate at the community table that evening with perhaps 40 others. The meal prepared in the common kitchen from produce that had been grown within a kilometer of where they sat. Dova sat across from him and looked at him with the sustained regard of a woman who had been reading Strangers for 15 years and was not easily misled. She said nothing to him through the meal, which he found considerably more uncomfortable than questions would have been. After the meal was cleared, Seren said, with the absence of ceremony that seemed to characterize everything she did, "Walk if you want." He walked beside her through the settlements, evening the last of the day's light settling over the green fields and the community structures and the specific quality of a place that had been built by people who needed it rather than by people who wanted to demonstrate something. They talked with the careful exploratory quality of two people who had decided to be honest without yet negotiating the terms of how much honesty to extend. He asked about the settlement's population. Where had they come from? What had brought them here? She said, everywhere the North decided it did not need people to go. He asked what she did each morning before the community woke. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I put my hands in the ground. He waited for elaboration. None came. He did not press her, recognizing in her silence something that was not evasion, but was a measured decision about what this conversation had yet earned, and choosing to respect the measurement. They reached the community hall on the return circuit. Seren paused at the doorway. The hall's south wall served as Greenhold's public display space, a physical record of the community's history maintained in photographs. Maps, census records, and 2 documents in frames. One was Greenhold's founding charter, written in Seren's hand. The other was at the center of the wall. He stepped closer. The official exile order from the Northern Kingdom's Council. The procedural language of an administrative process that had taken 11 minutes. The assessment language: drain on pack resources, no demonstrable alpha-compatible traits, no bloodline contribution. The procedural notation at the bottom: subject not consulted per established procedure. The council seal. And at the base, in the confident, neat, unhesitating script of a man who had been signing documents all day and had paused over none of them his own signature. He stood and read his own handwriting for a long time. He read the procedural language and the assessment language and the record of an 11-minute session, and he stood in a hall in a living city built in a dead wasteland by the woman those words had been written about, and he did not move for several minutes. Seren said, from the doorway behind him, "I put it there when we built the hall. Not as condemnation, as memory." She said, "The people who came here, because nowhere else would have them, need to understand where Greenhold came from. They need to know that what we are is not accidental. It is a direct and specific consequence of what was done to all of us, and we do not apologize for knowing that." He said, "What was this place made of?" She said, "Everything your kingdom decided was worth nothing." She said good night and walked down the corridor without looking back. And he stood in the empty hall with his signature on the wall and the silence of 3 years of consequences arranged around him. Until the lamp at the end of the corridor dimmed and the hall went dark. The gatekeeper's name was Erith, and she had the particular attentiveness of all people who managed borders, the sustained, deliberate habit of looking carefully at every face that passed through her gate, filing each one away with the specific industry of a woman who understood that faces were information and information was her professional responsibility. She noticed the face of the northern merchant named Run on his second morning, as he passed through the gate returning from the eastern perimeter. She studied it with the focused expression of someone running a comparison and finding the result unexpected. Then she went to find Dova. Dova set a northern coin on the edge of Seren's desk without preamble. She placed one deliberate finger on the face stamped into its surface and held Seren's gaze. Seren looked at the coin. She looked at it for a long time. She set down her pen. She said, "Ask him to come to the council hall. Tell him the full council will be present." She paused and then said, "Please also ask him to come now, before the morning session begins." She chose the hall deliberately. She chose the full council deliberately. This was not a private matter in any meaningful sense of the word. A king who arrived in her settlement without identifying himself had not chosen a private interaction. He had chosen an interaction he wanted to control, and she was declining to allow that framing. Selim entered the hall and saw the 12 council members at the table. And he saw Seren at its head, and he saw the coin in the center of the table. And his face did the specific thing a face did when it understood, with clarity and without available denial, that a concealment had ended. He did not deny it. She had not expected him to. Whatever else she had observed about him in 2 days, she had not observed dishonesty. She said, with the composure of a woman who had been preparing herself, in some sense, for 3 years to say this. "When you signed the exile order for Greenhold's founder, for me, what did you know about me?" He said nothing. The word sat in the room with the full weight of everything it contained. Not malice. Not considered judgment. Not even indifference as an active choice. Simply nothing, the complete absence of information, the complete absence of inquiry. The governance equivalent of a body in motion that had never been asked to pause and consider whether it should. She said, "Nothing is what we are working with." She allowed a moment of silence for the council members, who were exercising the disciplined restraint of people committed to process, even when process was difficult, and who deserved to hear what came next. She said, "You may remain in Greenhold through the harvest season. This is not an invitation extended to you personally. It is a decision made by this council based on the recognition that the North is experiencing a genuine food crisis, and that the people suffering from that crisis are not the council members who generated the conditions for it. Greenhold feeds people because this is a community that has decided this is who it is, not because the people asking have earned the right to be fed." She said, "While you are here, you will be treated as any other guest of this community with full courtesy, and with the expectation that you will contribute to the common work while benefiting from the common table." She paused. "You are not here as a king. Greenhold does not recognize the authority of northern kingship within its territory. You are here as a person who needs something that we have. And we are extending the same consideration we would extend to anyone in that position." Selim received this with the particular stillness of a man who had come south expecting to exercise authority and was encountering, at every step, a world that had been built specifically around the decision not to recognize that authority as self-evident. He said, "I understand." He said, "Thank you." She said, "I am not finished." The hall was very quiet. She said, "Your council is preparing a motion to annex Greenhold as a northern administrative territory. I know this because your third emissary, unlike his predecessors, was honest enough when pressed to describe the full scope of what he had been sent to accomplish. She let this land. She said, "I want you to know that this motion will fail. I filed formal sovereign territorial claims under the ancient Southern Covenant law on the day I built the first permanent structure in Greenhold 3 years ago. I did this because I understood from the day I arrived here that the North would eventually want what we built, and I had no intention of building something that could be claimed. Every legal provision required by the Covenant Protocol is in place." She looked at him steadily. "Any annexation attempt will fail legally. It will also produce a diplomatic crisis your kingdom cannot currently afford." Selim looked at this woman who had arrived in a dead wasteland with nothing, and had spent 3 years building something more legally secured than most sovereign territories in the known world, who had filed the paperwork on her first permanent structure before she had any reason to know that such paperwork would eventually be necessary, and who had done it anyway because she had understood the shape of what would come. He said quietly, "You prepared for everything." She said, "I prepared for everything. I had time." She said it with the tone of someone for whom this was a plain fact rather than a reproach, though it was also clearly a reproach. They gave him a room in the guest quarters, simple and functional. A narrow bed and an east-facing window and a small table. Nothing that spoke of the palace, nothing designed to impress or accommodate status. The room was warm and clean and adequate, which he was beginning to understand was precisely the standard Greenhold applied to everything. Warm and clean and adequate, and nothing wasteful beyond that. He did not sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed and did what he had always done when facing a problem that exceeded his immediate available frameworks. He reviewed what he knew with systematic honesty, which required first identifying every assumption he had been operating from and setting it aside, and then looking at what remained. He thought about the council session in which the exile motion had been presented. He had been reviewing 12 agenda items that day. The exile motion had been the 9th. He had reviewed a summary document that described the subject in the language of objective assessment criteria, the language of a process that had been designed. He understood now, to produce its conclusion before the review began. The criteria measured specific things. They had not measured what they did not measure, which was the actual totality of the subject's contribution and capacity. He thought about 50 acres of living ground in dead wasteland. He thought about the open council session, in which every person's perspective was heard before any decision was finalized. He had governed for 20 years from the principle that efficiency in decision-making was a virtue, that councils that moved quickly demonstrated competence and control. He thought about the decisions he had made quickly in service of that principle, and he thought about the 11-minute review, and he found the principle newly complicated. He thought about the community table. He had eaten at it twice now. Both times he had been seated next to people he did not know, who had talked to him as they would talk to anyone directly, with the easy assumption of equal standing. He had not been treated with deference or with hostility. He had been treated as a person at a table, which was an experience so different from every meal he had eaten in the past 20 years that it had taken him a full course to recognize what was strange about it. He thought about the coin that Irith had put on the table, and about Seren's face when she said, "Nothing is what we are working with." Not as accusation, the specific absence of accusation was what had struck him most, because he had prepared himself for accusation and found himself completely unprepared for the calm, clear, unflinching honesty of a woman who had decided to deal only in what was actually true. He had governed from assumptions about worth and status and the reliable indicators of contribution for 20 years. And those assumptions had been challenged and found insufficient not by argument, but by the simple sustained existence of Greenhold, which was not an argument, but an answer. And an answer was a different kind of evidence entirely. He got up before dawn. He went to the south field because he had watched her walk that direction the previous morning before the community woke, and because something he could not precisely name needed to see her working before it could settle into anything useful. She was already there, kneeling at the expansion perimeter in the pre-dawn dark, both hands pressed flat to the earth. The gift operating in the particular quiet way of something that had been doing this every morning for 3 years and had long since shed every trace of drama about it. He could feel the warmth in the air above her hands from 6 feet away, not magical or alarming. Simply warm, the specific warmth of a living process operating at its steady maintenance level. He sat on the low stone wall at the field's edge. She knew he was there. He was certain of this. She was too attentive to her surroundings not to register his arrival, but she did not acknowledge him or adjust what she was doing. And he understood this as its own kind of permission. You may be here, but this is not for you. He sat and watched her work in the pre-dawn dark and thought about 15 years of exceptional harvest yields attributed to favorable soil conditions, and about the warmth he could feel in the air above her hands, and about a woman who had answered a genuine need every day of her adult life and been assessed, at the end of it, as a drain on resources. The light came up gradually. Greenhold began to wake around them, the first sounds from the communal kitchen, the first voices in the pathways between the structures, the particular productive morning quality of a community that began its days with purpose. Seren withdrew her hands from the soil. The blue-white cold quality of her skin was visible in the early light. She pressed both hands against her thighs and flexed her fingers carefully and said, without looking at him, "You came." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He said, "I needed to see it." She looked at him for a moment, from her kneeling position at the perimeter, with the expression she used when she was deciding whether a response was sufficient. Then she said, "It is available to be seen." She rose and walked toward the community kitchen, and he sat on the wall in the early light and watched the field she had just worked settle into its morning depth of green. And he stayed there until the kitchen smells reached him and reminded him that he had somewhere to be. The conversation happened naturally, the way things happened in Greenhold, without scheduling, without the formal architecture of arranged meetings. In the space between one task and the next, where people who had been working near each other found themselves briefly at rest at the same time. They were both at the community kitchen's long outer table, eating the morning meal that the kitchen crew had left out for the early workers, when Seren said, "What do you want to understand?" He looked at her. He said, "Everything." The qualification, he might normally have added everything relevant. Everything pertaining to the current negotiation he left out, because it would have been dishonest. She looked at him for a moment, and then said, "Ask then." He asked about the gift's mechanics, not what it produced, which he had observed, but how it worked from the inside. She explained with the precise empirical language of someone who had spent 3 years studying her own capacity without the benefit of any external framework or reference. She described the warmth and the cold as a single exchange, two sides of the same process. She described the radius expansion rate and the daily maintenance requirement and the specific cost calculation she applied to avoid overextension. She described the way the gift seemed to carry its own awareness of what was needed, how it emphasized roots in the evening and surface growth in the morning, how it responded to damaged sections of the territory differently than to healthy ones. He listened with the full, undivided, assessment-free attention of a man who had recently discovered that the evaluative overlay he normally applied to everything had been causing him to miss fundamental information for 20 years. She showed him her hands. After the morning's perimeter work, the cold had not yet fully released her fingers. She held them out across the table flat, palms upward. The blue-white cold quality still visible in the skin of her fingertips, not as an act of vulnerability, but as a piece of evidence she had decided was relevant to the conversation and worth presenting accurately. He looked at her hands for a long moment. He said, "How long does the cold last after a major perimeter push?" She said, 3 to 4 hours for a standard session. After a significant expansion push, it can persist for most of a day. She said, "I have learned to pace the gift's use within its sustainable range. What the gift can sustain consistently is more valuable than what it can produce at maximum intensity once, and then requires 3 days of recovery from." He said, "You developed this understanding yourself?" She said, "There was no one else to develop it with." She said it without complaint, simply as a fact. The way she stated everything that was simply a fact. He said, "What do you want from a formal northern relationship in specific terms?" She looked at him with the expression that she used when she was deciding whether a question was what it appeared to be. Then she said, "Winter supply guarantees and short harvest years at fair exchange value, not as tribute. Medical resources available only in the north, specifically for conditions that our healers cannot currently address. Legal recognition of our export routes without northern tariffs. And a written guarantee, with specific legal enforcement provisions, that no annexation motion can be brought against Greenhold without the full participation and consent of our governing council." She paused. "The last item is what makes the others real. Without legal protection, the rest are gifts that can be revoked. And gifts that can be revoked are not agreements, they are dependency relationships, which is what we already had with the North, and which is why everyone in this settlement is here." He said, "Yes." He said, "You are right about the last item." He said it without qualification, as a plain acknowledgement. She looked at him with the expression she had filed under genuine different in quality from the other expressions she had observed him making, the ones with management behind them. He said, "I want to ask you something that is not political." She said, "Ask." He said, "Do you miss the North?" She was quiet for a long time, giving the question the full consideration it deserved rather than the quick dismissal it might have invited. Then she said, "I miss the orchard. The specific smell of it in early autumn before the harvest, that particular combination of ripe fruit and cold air and turned soil." She said, "I have planted 3 pear trees in Greenhold's west plot. They will produce in 2 more years." She paused. I stopped missing the rest of it when I understood that what I was missing was not the north as it actually was, but the north as I had constructed it in my imagination to make the place I lived livable. She said, "The real north signed a document about me without asking what I was. I do not miss that north. I am building the alternative to it." He said, "Yes." He said it the way a man said something he had decided was simply true and required no softening. The messenger arrived at the field gate at a run, breathing hard, carrying the particular expression of someone who has news that makes them deeply uncomfortable being the one to deliver it. The annexation motion had passed in his absence, through an emergency procedural provision, by a vote of 6-2. The council meeting that afternoon was the most difficult Greenhold had held. Not because it was hostile. Greenhold's council did not do hostile in the way of institutions built on power rather than principle. It was difficult because every person in the room was right about something, and the thing each person was right about was in genuine tension with the things the others were right about, and there was no version of resolution that required any of them to simply be wrong. Dova stood at the table's north end with the bearing of a woman who had spent 15 years developing specific and thoroughly tested opinions about the relationship between northern governance and the people it created conditions for, and who had just received the most comprehensive validation of those opinions she had ever encountered. She said, "I want to describe a pattern, not as accusation, as observation." She said, 3 years ago, the North assessed certain people as worth nothing and sent them south. We built something from nothing. 3 years later, the North notices that what we built has something the North needs. The North sends emissaries. The North sends the king himself. And while the king is sitting in our south field learning what his governance missed, the North passes an annexation motion using an emergency procedural provision that explicitly does not require his presence. She looked at the table. She said, "I would like someone to explain what part of this pattern suggests that a formal alliance with the North is a safer choice than sealed borders and sovereign isolation." The hall was quiet for a moment. Dova said, "I am calling for a founding vote. The mechanism is clear. Sealed borders, permanent sovereignty, and a formal end to any negotiation with the Northern Kingdom." The council members exchanged the expressions of people who understood, with full clarity, the legitimacy of both available positions and found the choice between them genuinely difficult. This was the correct response to a genuinely difficult choice, and Seren was grateful for it. She listened to the full discussion that followed. She did not direct it and did not interrupt it. Dova's argument was not wrong. The pattern she had described was accurate. 3 years of silence from the North followed by immediate interest the moment Greenhold's surplus became economically significant, culminating in an annexation motion passed while the king was in their settlement. If the pattern were the whole of the available information, sealed borders would be the correct conclusion. The pattern was not the whole of the available information. Seren was also aware that at that moment, at Greenhold's north gate, a military contingent carrying the Northern Kingdom's colors was positioned across the main trade route, the route through which Greenhold's food surplus traveled north to the provinces experiencing the most acute hunger. Selim found her after the contingent had been formally redirected to a holding position 3 miles north of the border. He said, "My council sent them ahead of the motion's passage. They are currently blocking the northern trade route." She looked at him. She said, very quietly, "They are using hunger as a lever. They know that Greenhold will not allow people to starve for a political principle. They're using that against us. He said, yes. He said it the way a man said something that was true and that he was ashamed of, without pretending either component away. She said, your council passed an annexation motion while you were sitting in our south field. He said, yes. She looked at him steadily and said, did you know they intended this? He said, I did not know they would move in my absence. I knew the motion existed. She said, and you came south anyway. He said, I came south because the emissaries I sent could not tell me what I needed to understand. He said, I did not come south to authorize the motion. I came south because I needed to understand what I had done 3 years ago and what had come from it. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at the map of the blocked route on the council hall wall, the road that connected Greenhold's surplus to the northern provinces where the shortage was most critical, where the people who were not responsible for any of this were the ones waiting for what she had grown. She said, the vote is at dawn. If it passes before we resolve this, the alliance closes permanently. She paused. I need you to understand what I am about to do and why I am doing it. It is not for you. It has never been for you. It is for the people who are hungry, and for what Greenhold is, and for what I built here. He said, I understand. She said, be in the south field in 3 hours. She went to the south field because she could not think clearly anywhere else. The hall was for governance, the specific kind of thinking that required other perspectives to arrive at its best form. The collective intelligence of a community applied to shared problems. The field was for the other kind. The kind that required stillness and soil, and the particular quality of attention that came when her hands were in the ground, and the gift was working, and her mind was free to move through whatever it needed to move through without the constant pull of other people's needs. She pressed her hands to the expansion perimeter and let the warmth flow and the cold follow, and thought about Dova's argument, which she could not dismiss because it was not dismissible. She thought about the contingent blocking the route and the hunger behind it and the people in the northern provinces who were waiting for food they had not been told was being withheld for political leverage. She thought about the founding vote and its legitimacy, the community's right to make this decision. The rightness of that right, her own absolute unwillingness to override it. She was still thinking when she heard him sit down in the field. Not on the wall this time. He sat in the field itself, in the soil she had made. Among the plants she had grown from nothing, with the quality of a man who had understood that the appropriate gesture in this moment was not distance but presence. He said, I want to ask you something that is not about the vote or the contingent or the motion. She said, ask. He said, what do you want? Not Greenhold's needs. Not the political calculus. You. What do you want from the rest of your life? She was quiet for a long time, her hands in the soil, the warmth flowing steadily outward. Then she said, I want what I built to outlast me. I want the people who came here, because no one else would have them, to have somewhere that cannot be taken from them by a signature from someone who did not ask their name. She said, I want the children who were born here, who have never known what it means to be assessed and found insufficient, to grow up in a world where that experience is history rather than possibility. She said, I want to have built something real enough that the ground holds it even after I am gone. He said, I can give you that. Legally, formally, irrevocably. She said, can you? She said it without hostility, as a genuine question. The kind of person asked when the answer mattered enough to require accuracy. He said, I am here. I have been sitting in your field for 2 days learning what governance looks like when it is done well. I am asking. I am not signing anything without reading it this time. She looked at him in the field's living darkness, the gifts, warmth, and the soil beneath both of them, the green moving through its night rhythms around them, and she said, That is the first thing you have said since you arrived that I believe completely. She said it without cruelty and without softness, simply as a precise report of what was true. He said, I know I cannot undo what was done. She said, no. She said, but you can determine what comes next. And what comes next, in my experience, is the more important question. He said, after a moment, what do you need from me specifically to make this work? She said, honesty, consistency, and a willingness to sit in discomfort when what you learn requires you to change your position. She said, those are not difficult things to promise. They are very difficult things to do. He said, I know. She said, I know you know. She said, knowing and doing are different things. I have been watching you do it for 2 days, and I think you may be capable of it, but I am not prepared to stake what I have built on a 2-day observation. He said, what would make you prepared? She said, let me think about it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the specific full silence of 2 people sitting in the same space with everything between them present and unresolved, and neither of them trying to prematurely close it. It was Dova's footsteps that ended it, quick and purposeful on the path from the hall, carrying news in the very rhythm of her movement. She said, without ceremony, the council has moved the vote up. The contingent's position constitutes a security concern under Greenhold's governing charter, which allows the council to call an emergency session. The vote is in 4 hours. Seren stood. She said, I need the discussion held open, whatever it takes. Dova said, where are you going? Seren looked at the perimeter of the south field, the living boundary she had pressed outward foot by foot every morning for 3 years. The exact edge of what she had made from dead ground and time and daily cost. She said, I am going to make the vote irrelevant. She said, the sovereignty ritual takes 4 hours. If I complete it before the vote concludes, Greenhold's territorial sovereignty is encoded permanently under covenant law, and the legal basis for any annexation attempt ceases to exist regardless of any motion passed by any body. Dova looked at her for a long moment, and then looked at Selim, and then looked at Seren again with the expression of a woman making a fast and accurate assessment. She said, the full perimeter circuit at gift intensity will cost you significantly. Seren said, yes. She said, I know what it will cost. That has never changed anything before. Dova said, I will hold the discussion. The ritual's rules were explained by Hale Greenhold's eldest resident, 90 years old, who had come south 4 decades earlier and had spent those decades maintaining a thorough knowledge of the ancient covenant law with the patience of someone who understood that the law would eventually be needed and wanted to be ready when it was. She sat across from Seren in the small room off the council hall and said, the sovereign walk claims the territory permanently under the covenant framework, which predates the Northern Kingdom's legal charter by 200 years and is recognized by every legal system that acknowledges the Southern Covenant's authority. She said, it cannot be performed by proxy or in stages. The claimant walks the complete perimeter of the claimed territory with both hands pressed to the ground at every step, continuously without interruption from start to finish. The territorial blessing flows from the claimant's body into the earth along the full circuit, and when the circuit closes, the seal is permanent and legally binding under covenant law. She looked at Seren's hands. She said, for an ordinary person, the ritual is a formality, a long walk and an intention. She said, for someone with your gift, the blessing will be significant. The gift will transmit at full intensity for the entire circuit's duration, which means the cost will be proportional to that intensity sustained across the full perimeter length. The full perimeter of Greenhold's expanded territory was 4 miles. Seren said, I understand the cost. Hale said, "I do not know that you do completely. What I can tell you is that the old law does not permit the walk to be completed by a person who cannot sustain it. If you collapse before the circuit closes, the claim is incomplete and cannot be restarted under the same provisions." Seren said, "Then I will not collapse." Hale looked at her for a long moment, the particular regard of a very old woman who has seen many things and has developed specific opinions about the difference between confidence and recklessness, and knows which she is looking at. She said, "All right." She began at the northwest corner, while the founding vote was still gathering its quorum. Walking clockwise at a deliberate and sustainable pace, both hands pressed low, the gift transmitting through her palms into the soil at every step. Not the controlled morning session transmission of her daily work, the full, continuous, open-channel transmission of a person who had decided to give everything available and trust that the total would be sufficient. The warmth flowed out of her in a current rather than a stream. She felt it going, and she felt the cold following it, and she kept walking. The first mile was difficult in the specific way of sustained effort at a level that exceeded the daily maintenance range harder than ordinary sessions, requiring the constant attention of someone managing a large and continuous output, but manageable. The second mile was harder. The cold had reached her elbows, and the warmth that flowed from her hands had taken on the quality of something being drawn from reserves rather than surplus, the gift reaching deeper into her body's available supply. She kept her pace consistent and her breathing even, and directed her attention away from the calculation of distance remaining, because that calculation was not useful. The third mile required everything she had in the category of will. The cold had reached past her shoulders into her chest. Her fine motor coordination was reduced. The warmth from her hands was still present, still transmitting, still doing the work the ritual required, but it was coming from a depth she had not previously accessed. And the accessing of it carried a cost she could feel in the specific, bone-deep way of a body that is spending something it will need time to recover. She kept walking. At the midpoint of the third mile, approximately 3 miles into the 4-mile circuit, with 1 mile remaining, the gift flickered. Not failed, flickered, the transmission becoming inconsistent for 3 or 4 steps. The warmth from her hands dropping and then recovering, the warm-cold exchange momentarily disrupted. She forced it back through the disciplined control of 3 years of daily practice. It steadied. She did not stop. But she was aware, with the clear self-knowledge she had always applied to her own capacity, that she had reached the boundary of what she could sustain without something she did not have alone in the dark at the 3rd mile of a 4-mile walk. He had been watching from the eastern ridge for the past hour. He had not gone back to the guest room after Seren left the field. He had followed at a respectful distance, and then climbed the ridge when it became clear that what she was doing required space rather than company. And he had watched from above as she began the northwest corner and turned south, and then east along the bottom boundary, and then north up the eastern side. From the ridge, in the pre-dawn dark, her progress along the perimeter was visible as a quality of warmth in the air above her path, a living distinction between the ground she was blessing and the ground she had not yet reached. A line drawn through the dead wasteland by the specific presence of what she carried. He tracked her progress and counted the circuit sections and knew, when she reached the beginning of the 3rd mile, that she was entering the range of serious depletion. He knew what serious depletion looked like on her. He had seen it twice at the field wall, had watched her manage the recovery from major sessions with the careful systematic attention of someone who had learned her limits empirically and respected them. When the gift flickered at 3 miles, he was already moving. He came down the ridge at a pace that was not quite a run and reached the perimeter path at the point where she was walking. and he fell into step beside her without speaking. He could see the cost on her clearly, the white-blue cold of her hands even in the darkness, the controlled quality of her breathing, the absolute stillness of her face that was not peace but concentration, the particular quality of a person who has identified the thing that must be done and has applied every available resource to doing it and has nothing left for anything else. She said, without looking at him, "You cannot perform the blessing. Only the claimant can do that." He said, "I know." He said, "Tell me what you need." She said, "Walk with me." The cold takes attention away from the walking. If you are here, the attention has somewhere else to go. He said, "Then I am here." He walked at her left side with his shoulder near hers, close enough for his warmth to be physically present, not touching, not directing, simply there. An anchor in the specific way that the presence of a person who has chosen to be somewhere without being asked provides something that cannot be provided any other way. The gift steadied. Not restored to full strength, she was still paying the full cost, still drawing from reserves, still operating at the edge of what she could sustain. But steadily, consistently, without the flickering that had signaled collapse potential. The warmth from her hands continued its transmission into the soil at every step. The territorial blessing moving through the earth beneath them, writing itself into the ground with the permanent clarity of something that could not be unwritten. The 3rd mile completed. The 4th began. He did not speak. He did not encourage. He did not suggest that she could do it or that she was doing well or any of the things that people said to people who were doing something very hard, and that almost always made the very hard thing harder. He simply walked at her pace with his shoulder near hers. She was operating on will for the last mile. He could see it, the mechanics of her walking had become purely deliberate, each step a separate decision. The gift running from a depth that was costing her in ways that the 3-day recovery would not be sufficient for. He walked and said nothing and stayed. She reached the northwest corner. She reached the starting point. When her hands met the soil at the circuit's closure, and the blessing completed its full circuit through the territory's ground, the land responded. It was not subtle, and it was not brief. The sovereignty seal moved through the earth of Greenhold's entire territory in a wave that was visible from every point within the settlement's borders, a warmth moving outward from the perimeter in all directions simultaneously, the ground deepening in color, in density, in the specific quality of earth that has been claimed rather than merely inhabited. Every plant in every field responded, a simultaneous deepening of green, a reaching toward the sky. The mycorrhizal network pulsing with the recognition of permanent belonging. Every person in Greenhold who was awake felt it through their feet. Seren folded. He was ready, both arms solid and certain, her weight against his chest. Her hands still carrying the last of the warmth that had transmitted the blessing and were now cooling rapidly toward the depth of cold that her worst previous sessions had produced. She said, her face against his shoulder, her voice depleted but fully present, "Tell me the vote is still running." He said, "I can hear Dova from here." The sound of Dova's voice carried from the council hall across the settlement's quiet, steady, and sustained. The voice of a woman who had promised to hold a discussion open and was honoring that promise with every tool her 15 years of experience had given her. She made a sound against his shoulder that was almost a laugh, and he held her in the living dark at the boundary of the territory she had made real. And the land settled around them into the permanent, encoded, legally unassailable sovereignty of something that had been built by hand from dead ground and daily cost, and an absolute refusal to accept that nothing was possible. The founding vote reconvened as the sun came fully up, and Seren stood at the front of the assembly hall. She had rested for 40 minutes. It was not sufficient, and her body knew it was not sufficient, but it was what she had. She stood with the specific dignity of a woman who had paid the price before the audience arrived, and was not going to perform the cost for their observation. Her hands were still carrying the residual cold of the ritual visible in the quality of her skin, which had not yet fully returned to its ordinary warmth, and she stood with them open at her sides, not hiding them. She said, "The sovereignty ritual was completed 40 minutes ago. Greenhold's territorial claim is permanently encoded in the ground under covenant law. Our borders are ours legally and irrevocably, regardless of any motion passed by any external body, regardless of any vote taken inside or outside this hall. This is not a political position that can be negotiated or overturned. It is a legal fact." She paused. The hall was very still. She said Dova was right. The quality of the silence changed. Dova, at the council table, looked at her with the expression of a woman who had expected counterargument and found something she had not prepared herself for. Seren said, "The pattern Dova described is accurate. The North had 3 years to acknowledge this community. The North's first sustained engagement with us produced an annexation motion and a military contingent blocking our food route. The founding vote, she called, was a legitimate response to a legitimate threat, and I want this assembly to know that I would not have argued against its conclusion." She said, "I completed the sovereignty ritual before the vote concluded not to override this community's right to make this decision, but to ensure that whatever this community decides to do, it is deciding freely, from a position of absolute legal security and not from a position of pressure." She said, "I needed the borders to be ours before I could offer what I am about to offer. Because what I give from a position of security is a different thing from what I would give under threat, and Greenhold does not give things under threat. We established this at the beginning." She turned to Selim at the back of the hall. She said, "King Selim of the North is prepared to sign a formal alliance treaty. The treaty includes full legal recognition of Greenhold's sovereignty, equal terms on all trade and resource exchange, royal prosecution of any future annexation attempt, the formal abolition of unilateral exile authority, the establishment of a joint rights review commission with full investigative authority, and a written guarantee that no person in either territory may be removed from their community without a formal hearing at which they are present and permitted to speak." She said, "I am prepared to accept this treaty on Greenhold's behalf if this community votes to accept the alliance." She said, "I am asking this community to vote on whether we want an alliance. Not on whether our borders are secure, they are secure. Not on whether we can survive without the North, we can, and we have demonstrated this. The question is whether we believe the North is capable of the kind of change that the treaty requires of it, and whether Greenhold's purpose includes being part of that change or being separate from it." She looked at Dova. She said, "I am asking Dova to sit on the Joint Commission as Greenhold's founding representative, because she has been right about the North for longer than anyone else in this room, and because that knowledge belongs at the table where the work of changing it will happen." Dova was still for a long moment. She looked at the framed exile order on the south wall. She looked at Seren. She looked at the order again. Selim stepped forward from the back of the hall and said, clearly on the record, in front of every person assembled, the exile order signed 3 years ago was an error. The process that produced it was a failure of governance that I am responsible for, and I am correcting it formally now, in this assembly, in this room built by the person that error sent south. He said, Greenhold is a sovereign territory. Its founder is its queen. The Northern Kingdom formally recognizes both, and accepts the treaty terms as Seren has described them. The hall was very quiet. Dova said, call the vote on the alliance. The vote passed. The treaty session was held the following morning with both parties seated at the same table. Seren had drafted the terms in the hours after the assembly, working with the careful slowness of hands that were still recovering their warmth. Writing in the precise small handwriting she had always used for records that mattered and needed to last. She had learned young that the only documents worth writing were the ones built to survive the eventual arrival of people who would prefer them to say something different. And she had written with that principle as the organizing intention. She placed the drafted terms in front of Selim without comment. He read them, all of them, every clause, every subsection, every provision for enforcement and review. She watched him read and noted the quality of his attention, not the skimming of a man performing due diligence, but the actual reading of someone who intended to understand what each word meant before he accepted it. He asked 3 questions. Each one was specific and practical. Not objections, but requests for clarification on points where precision mattered for implementation. Her answers to the first 2 refined their respective clauses in ways that made the protections more durable. She incorporated the changes without comment. The treaty contained the following provisions: the formal dissolution of the Council's unilateral exile authority, effective immediately and retroactively across the Northern Kingdom. No person removed from their community without a formal hearing. The subject present and permitted to speak in their own behalf. The bilateral sovereignty recognition, legally binding under both Northern Charter and Southern Covenant law, with specific and enumerated prohibitions against annexation and specific and enumerated enforcement mechanisms. The Standing Food Alliance at annually reviewed fair trade value, with a specific provision making the Northern Kingdom legally liable for any interference with Greenhold's established trade routes. The Omega Rights Review Commission, joint, equally represented from both territories, with full investigative authority across all relevant records and archives, reporting publicly and without restriction. And in the preamble, a provision she had added in the final hours of drafting and had debated with herself for 30 minutes before deciding it was necessary. A formal written acknowledgement that the founding of Greenhold was the direct and specific result of a governance failure in the Northern Kingdom, and that the treaty existed in part as an accounting of that failure and a commitment to the process of addressing it. Selim had come to this provision and slowed. She had watched him read it twice. He said, "This stays." She said, "Yes." He signed. She took the pen. She held it for a moment above the signature line and looked at the treaty with its royal seal and its joint commission provisions and its formal acknowledgement of what had been done and what was being done about it. She said, "The last document with a royal seal I handled told me that I was a drain on resources and that my removal did not require my consultation." She said it without bitterness, with the clarity of a precise historical observation. She said, "I want the session record to note that I signed this document freely, from a position of legal security, with full knowledge of its terms, and with the understanding that if its terms are not honored, the covenant law that already protects this territory will be the first and most immediate enforcement mechanism available." She signed. Selim said, "For the session record, the Northern Kingdom acknowledges that Greenhold's founding was an act of extraordinary capacity and extraordinary courage." He said, "This kingdom is in Greenhold's debt in a way that cannot be repaid through trade terms, and I want that acknowledged on the public record." The council scribe wrote it down. Seren looked at the signed document, the seal, and the signatures and the provisions she had written, to last, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for 3 years. Not vindication. Something quieter and more durable than vindication. Simply the knowledge that what she had built was now protected in every available way. and that the protection had been negotiated from strength, and that the document bearing her signature was the first one with a royal seal that she was permitted to keep. The celebration was Greenhold's own. Not formal, not ceremonial, not organized according to the conventions of kingdoms that celebrated power through displays of it. Simply the community gathering in the square at the end of the day that had contained the sovereignty ritual and the vote and the treaty signing, setting out tables and food and the particular quality of warmth that a community produced when it had survived something real together and was choosing, deliberately and with full knowledge of what it had cost, to be glad. Seren moved through the celebration with the ease she had developed over 3 years of knowing. Every face and every name and every story of how each person had arrived here and what they had been before arrival and what they were in the process of becoming. She moved the way she moved through the morning rounds with the full specific attention that treated each person as worth attending to, which was the single most political act she performed every day, and which she did not think of as political, but as correct. Dova found her at the edge of the main tables. She said, "You won it for all of us, including the ones who were trying to vote it a different direction." Seren said, "You were protecting what we built. That is not a thing that can be wrong, even when the specific protection turns out to be unnecessary." She said, "The fact that the territory was secured before the vote doesn't make the vote's legitimacy retroactively less real. We needed to know that the community would fight for itself. Now we know." Dova looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman adjusting her assessment of a situation and finding the adjusted version better than what she had expected. She said, "I am going to be very difficult on the Joint Commission." Seren said, "I know. That is why I asked you." Dova said, "And if the North's commitment turns out to be performance rather than substance?" Seren said, "Then Greenhold is already sovereign, and the borders are already ours, and we continue exactly as we have been." She said, "The alliance is an opportunity. Our existence does not depend on it." Dova looked at her once more, a final, comprehensive assessment, and said, "All right." Then she went to find food, which Seren took as the highest expression of Dova's confidence she was likely to receive. The 11 children who had been born in Greenhold ran through the celebration with the specific freedom of people who had never known what it meant to be assessed and found wanting, who had grown up in a community where belonging was the baseline rather than the reward for demonstrating sufficient value. The first generation who would know exile only as their parents' story and not as their own experience. Seren watched them and felt the particular satisfaction of work that had produced something that would outlast the work. Selim found her at the south field's boundary, where the celebration's warmth reached them softened and gentle through the evening air. He stood beside her, and they both looked at the field, green and gold in the setting light, 3 years of daily cost and accumulated care, the oldest living thing in what had been dead ground. He said, "You were going to be this regardless of whether I came south." She said, "Yes." He said, "I know." He let the silence hold for a moment, and then he said, "I am glad I came anyway." He said it quietly, and without the management of implications she had come to expect from statements that carried this kind of weight. Simply glad, plainly said. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I needed to understand what I had been building around." He said, "The governance I have practiced for 20 years has been built around a specific understanding of what matters and what doesn't. And the understanding was wrong, and I could not have learned that it was wrong from inside it." He paused. "I came south expecting to find a settlement that needed something from me. I found something I needed to learn from." He said, "That is not a comfortable thing to discover, but I think it is a necessary one." She looked at him in the evening light, this man, who had signed a document about her without knowing her name and had ridden 3 days south in a grain merchant's coat and sorted irrigation piping, and sat in her field before dawn, and walked the last mile of the sovereignty circuit at her shoulder, and she thought about what she had built, and what it had cost, and what it had produced, and she took his hand. The field responded to her touch the way it always did, a deepening of green moving outward from the point of contact. Slow and warm and absolutely certain, pushing a few more feet into the wasteland's remaining edge. As it did every morning, as it would continue to do. The evening settled over Greenhold like something that had been waiting a long time to arrive. 5 years later, Greenhold's living territory was larger than 3 northern provinces combined. The green had continued its outward movement, month by month, season by season, not dramatically, not in sudden surges, but with the consistent daily accumulation that Seren had always understood was more durable than any event-driven growth. The wasteland that had once extended in every direction from the boundary stone was now the wasteland's edge. And the edge moved outward every morning before the community woke. The Omega Rights Review Commission had completed its first full audit in the treaty's second year, and had formally dissolved 47 provisions across both territories that permitted persons to be assessed, removed, or restricted without consultation or formal hearing. Dova had sat on the commission through every session with the ferocity of a woman spending 15 years of accumulated expertise in the most productive available direction, and the provisions had not survived her attention. New provisions of the kind that had produced Greenhold could not be introduced without the Commission's full review, which was structured to make such introduction sufficiently difficult that it was no longer the path of least resistance. The bilateral trade relationship had ended the Northern Famine's acute phase within the treaty's first winter, and had established, over the subsequent 4 years, an economic interdependence between the two territories that made conflict between them structurally irrational. Greenhold fed the North through its most difficult seasons. The North provided medical expertise and certain resource categories that Greenhold had not yet been able to develop independently. The relationship was not equal in every dimension, but it was honest, and it was reviewed annually by a joint commission that included Dova, and nothing about it was permitted to drift into the category of tribute. The exile order was still on the community hall wall. It had been suggested twice that it could come down now that its context had so thoroughly changed. Both times Seren had said the same thing: leave it where it is. She had said, the people who come here now, who arrive having heard that there is a place in the south where the ground is alive and everyone is counted, need to understand where Greenhold came from. They need to know that this place was built not in spite of what was done to its founders, but specifically because of it, and that the building was a choice made from the dead ground of a decision that intended to erase them. She said, that document is not a wound we display. It is the foundation we stand on. She and Selim governed jointly, in the way she had always understood joint governance should work: 2 sovereign territories, equal in standing, with full and complete authority over their own affairs, choosing freely to operate in collaboration because the collaboration produced better outcomes than the alternatives, and because the choice being free was what made it mean something. They had argued productively about the Commission's investigative scope. They had disagreed, substantively and on the record, about the Northern Trade Tariff Review. They had found, through the arguments and the disagreements, that honest conflict between people who respected each other's authority was more generative than the performance of agreement. There was a daughter. She was 4 years old, and she had discovered her hands on a warm morning in the West Plot's garden, kneeling between the pear trees that had finally come into their first full production, the trees Seren had planted in the first year with the seeds that had been the only thing she carried from Thornhaven's orchard. The seeds she had kept because they had seemed worth keeping. The girl had pressed both palms into the soil between the trees with the focused, unhurried attention of someone discovering something they already knew was there. And the warmth had flowed from her hands in small and tentative and completely unmistakable amounts, and the soil beneath her palms had stirred. She had looked up at Seren with her hands still in the earth, and her face carrying the specific calm of a child who has just encountered something large and true, and is not afraid of it. She had said, "Look." Seren had looked. She had said, "I see you, love. I see everything you are." She had said it in all the ways it could be meant simultaneously, as a mother looking at a child, as a woman recognizing the continuation of something she had begun, as a person for whom being seen completely had once been the thing most withheld, and who had decided that it would be the first and most consistent thing she gave. They named her Mira, not after anyone, after a word that meant bright in the old southern tongue, which Hale had taught Seren in the years when they had worked together on the covenant documentation, and had found that certain things could only be said precisely in a language that had been built by people who understood what the South had always been. The original South Field, 7 years old now, the oldest living ground in Greenhold. The first impossible 18-inch radius that had grown from 2 exhausted palms on a cold morning when a woman had nowhere else to be and had pressed herself into the earth and given it everything she had, was Seren's first place every morning. She went there alone, as she had always gone alone, before the community woke and before the day's demands began. She knelt at the oldest section of living ground, where the soil had been receiving her gift for 7 years and had become something richer and more specific than anything she could have cultivated by intention. She pressed her palms flat to the earth. The warmth flowed out of her, steady and familiar as breathing. The cold followed it, the known cost of the known exchange. The green deepened around her hands as it always deepened, the living world responding to the specific presence of what she was and had always been, whether or not anyone had been counting. She did not mind the cost. She had made her peace with the cost a long time ago, in the understanding that the only alternative to paying it was to stop, and stopping had never once been available to her in any real sense. The gift had always known what it was for, long before she had. The earth had known. The dead soil of the wasteland had known. On the night she fell asleep with her hands on it and woke to green, that there was something here that had been waiting for her with the patient certainty of something that understood it would eventually receive what it needed. She had just needed to arrive. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If Seren's journey gave you something today, if any part of what she built in the dead ground resonated with something in your own life, please like this video. It takes 1 second, and it means more than you know. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you are there for the next story. Because there is always another woman, another gift, another kingdom built from what someone else called nothing. And please, in the comments, tell me what part of this story stayed with you. Tell me about something you built from a place of nothing. Tell me which moment hit the hardest, or which character you understood from the inside. This channel exists because of those conversations. Every single comment is read. Thank you for being here, and for listening this far. I will see you in the next story.